Monona Terrace figured if they delayed it long enough through litigation and legislation, inflation alone would make it too expensive and it would be abandoned. And they were right. Now, it is heresy to say, but I think in a way those who fought Monona Terrace did us a favor, because it had the same size theaters and art gallery as the Overture Center for the Arts. If we had built this, I think it is highly unlikely that Jerry Fauci would have given us another $205 million to replace it, which would have been too bad because Overture is such a much better building, and the Monona Terrace is in such a poor location for a performing arts center. There just aren't enough bars and restaurants, and it's got lousy mass transit. And even as a convention center, it would have failed because it only has 45% of the convention space in the Monona Terrace that we finally did build. And obviously there will be no way to expand from Wright's design. There was another effort in the late 60s by Wright's son-in-law, William Wesley Peters. It was not as politicized, but it met the same fate. The construction budget did not satisfy the construction drawings, and the project was abandoned. And this would have been just phase one of Monona Basin, a staggering statement of architectural ambition, 3 miles from Olin Park to Law Park. This would have been John Nolan's Grand Esplanade on steroids. These plans are as far as it got. The next dominant issue was urban renewal, especially what city staff and the Madison Redevelopment Authority did to the eastern tip of the Greenbush addition. The Bush was a 60-year-old neighborhood that was international, intergenerational, interreligious, and interracial, but unfortunately had inadequate infrastructure. So the MRA turned this into this, the Triangle Urban Renewal Area. It is to Madison's shame that we knowingly destroyed this important community without a second thought. It is further insulting to see how poorly the program was planned and executed, and especially how it failed to provide timely, affordable replacement housing. But I do not think the motive was malevolent. I do not think its purpose was to break up the neighborhood. The city didn't care about the neighborhood. The city only cared about streets and sewers and building codes and the highest use of land. The community was not the target, but yes, it was collateral damage, and the city was okay with that. Urban renewal was a major issue when Mayor Reynolds won re-election in 1963 and was on the ballot itself in 1964 when it barely survived a referendum to end urban renewal and abolish the Redevelopment Authority. Reynolds, both newspapers, and the entire political and business elite opposed that referendum, and it failed by only 367 votes out of 37,000 cast. Think how angry people must have been at urban renewal to have come that close to rejecting years and years of future federal aid. But wait till you hear the kicker. Now, the hardest part about urban renewal in 62 and 63 was finding replacement housing for the displaced black households. With no law at any level against housing discrimination, non-whites here had access to 27% of the rental units in the city and 10% of the housing for sale. Housing discrimination was so universal, it was reflected on the federal forms. Of almost 19,000 housing units in the city of Madison, non-whites had access to 3,500. That's less than 19%. That is why, as the decade opened, 76% of Madison non-whites lived in just 4 census tracts, and 8 aldermanic wards had no non-whites at all. So the civil rights movement was a big issue throughout the decade, and it was a very big deal in December 1963 when Mayor Reynolds, a conservative white businessman, cast the tie-breaking vote to enact the first law or ordinance in the state of Wisconsin to ban housing discrimination. And the principal drafter of that historical ordinance was that young attorney whom we've already met, Another indication that Madison in the 60s really was a special place. A figure of statewide historical significance, the first female justice of the Supreme Court, the first female Chief Justice, was a leading member of the Mayor's Commission on Human Rights and wrote the ordinance creating the Equal Opportunities Commission. And Shirley Abrahamson was not the only future Supreme Court Chief Justice to play an important role in local politics. Here's Raleigh Day, chairman of the Madison Housing Authority, which tried to build public housing for the people displaced by the Redevelopment Authority at the dedication of the Triangle's Gay Braxton Apartments, Madison's first public housing since veterans housing in 1949. That's Raleigh under the arrow next to Mayor Otto Fesky. The good news is that all those tenants were from the old Greenbush edition. The bad news is that their houses had been torn down in 1962 and 63, and the grand opening was June 1965. The University of Wisconsin was the fourth great issue throughout the decade because it is the critical component that makes Madison Madison, and not just when protests spill out into the streets. Economically, intellectually, emotionally, socially, culturally, the university is central to our identity. And in the 60s, the university had a profound impact on downtown planning and development. Thanks to massive amounts of federal funds and a president in Fred Harvey Harrington who proudly proclaimed himself the biggest imperialist since Teddy Roosevelt, the university turned this into this and created such a backlash that it was the cause of the referendum to end urban renewal and abolish the Redevelopment Authority, not the Triangle. The Triangle residents had very little political and economic capital. They couldn't fight back. But the property owners around the Southeast Dorm expansion area had political capital, and they could fight back. And they are the ones who almost ended urban renewal. So what's really important about university expansionism is that that's what caused the decade's first rift between town and gown, not student protests. The 1964 referendum to end urban renewal and abolish the Redevelopment Authority was 18 months before any student protest generated appreciable backlash. Harrington and the regents are to blame for the decade's first community hostility toward the campus, not the students. It was the adults, not the kids. Of course, radicals and revolutionaries did cause serious problems for the university and themselves, most especially on October 27, 1966, at the Stock Pavilion, when Senator Edward Kennedy headlines a campaign appearance for Governor Pat Lucey. And a dozen or so leaders from the Committee to End the War in Vietnam heckle him so aggressively that Kennedy gives up and leaves the stage. 8,000 students sign a letter of apology for what a handful have done. But there's more than just a symbolic public relations backlash. There is a substantive reaction by the university with profound implications. Because it was the heckling of Senator Kennedy that caused the faculty to adopt the rule against obstructing university activities. They actually called it the Kennedy Rule. This was the rule protesters knowingly violated when they blocked the hallways of the Commerce Building in October 1967 to block the Dow Chemical Company from conducting job interviews because they made napalm for use in Vietnam. It was to remove the students from the building, to enforce the Kennedy Rule that Chancellor William Sewell called in the Madison Police Department. As you may have heard, that also did not go well. The Battle of Dow radicalized thousands of students and made the community curious about the anti-war movement, and it made a star out of Paul Soglin, who you see under the red arrow, about to be beaten. Madison police officers wail on the obstructors for 13 minutes, sending 52 to the emergency room, most of them with scalp lacerations that bleed profusely but are not really serious injuries. But then on the plaza outside, a different dynamic. It's class break, and suddenly a crowd of several thousand, and many are fighting back, some with rocks and bottles. The police are under siege, several officers are severely injured. Emory finally calls for tear gas, its first use anywhere to quell an on-campus protest. This is the moment when Police Chief Emery vows he will never be outnumbered again, that he will respond at all future demonstrations with overwhelming force, even before such force is necessary. This is the birth of the policy put into place on Mifflin Street on May 3rd, 1969. The cops helped spur a riot on Mifflin Street because they showed up in riot gear. They were in riot gear because they had bricks and rocks thrown at them at Dow. They were at Dow to enforce the Kennedy rule against obstruction. An event in 1967 creates the conditions for an event in 1966 creates the conditions for an event in 1967 that helps produce an event in 1969. The spirit moves through time and leaves us with history. And finally, bringing it all full circle, the 60s ends with the deaths of two stellar citizens who fought each other for years over Frank Lloyd Wright and Monona Terrace. Joseph W. Bud Jackson, 90, indefatigable advocate for Madison improvements and implacable foe of Frank Lloyd Wright and Monona Terrace. Colonel Jackson organized the Army's last mounted cavalry unit under General Jack Black Pershing in World War I, was later business manager for the medical clinic founded by his father, a Civil War surgeon. He left the Jackson Clinic in 1937 to found and lead the Madison and Wisconsin Foundation, the forerunner to our Chamber of Commerce. He raised private funds for the University Arboretum, the Madison School Forest, and 18 city parks, helped get public funds for the airport, VA hospital, and city-county building, and helped kill Monona Terrace. And economics professor emeritus Harold Groves, 72, a founder of the modern cooperative movement, the intellectual and political father of Wisconsin's first in the nation Unemployment Compensation Act, and an important supporter of Frank Lloyd Wright. One of 6 children of a Lodi farm couple, Groves earned 3 degrees at Wisconsin, took his doctorate in 1927 under the legendary John R. Commons, whose endowed chair he would later hold, served in the Assembly and Senate in the 30s. He was the chief faculty sponsor and patron of the interracial, interreligious women's cooperative Groves House. He and his wife Helen were friends of Frank Lloyd Wright since the 30s and leaders of Citizens for Monona Terrace. Groves served 6 years on the auditorium committee until he was replaced by Mayor Henry Reynolds after that momentous election of 1961. May their memories be for a blessing. That concludes my talk. Thank you very much for your kind attention. If you need to leave, it's 1 o'clock, and for those who wish to stay, I'm happy to have comments and questions. We're going to thank you all very much for coming. In the back.
When you were doing your extensive research on the triangle proposal, did you have to read a lot of council meeting notes, and if so, were they informative enough for you to get the feeling of
It wasn't so much the council meeting notes, it was the minutes of the Madison Redevelopment Authority. I read every meeting's minutes for the entire decade.
For the entire decade?
Sure.
Wow.
I read all the minutes, and then you read the minutes, and in addition to the minutes, the federal reports, because housing document I had, that's taken from the federal report. I mean, there were just, my 3 loose leaf binder of federal reports are yay thick. It's because they're years and years of, here's our application, here's what we're going to do, here's the description. I've read every building inspection for all the buildings that were in the triangle. I mean, I've got pictures and the building inspector reports of every building that was torn down in the triangle.
So you could say those minutes turned into hours.
Thank you. Say goodnight, Gracie. The research was a tremendous amount of fun. I started the research by reading every day's newspaper for the entire decade, and the quality of newspapering back then was really, really high. I mean, first of all, there was so much advertising that the newspapers were so fat, and the stories were so long, and the reporters were so good that it was just a delight to read all these stories. And I mentioned Dave Zwiefel at the beginning. Dave Zwiefel was a reporter back then, so I'd read a Dave Zwiefel story and I'd put it in the footnotes just to complete the circle. The quality of journalism was so high. Now the Daily Cardinal, Jeff Greenfield was the editor of the Daily Cardinal for 2 years. We have Emmy Award-winning reporters. We have Pulitzer Prize-winning reporters working for the Daily Cardinal. Walt Bogdanich, Lowell Bergman, these Rita Braver. These are people who you've seen on the news and in newspapers for decades. Were students here, and the quality of journalism was just very dependable. The only stories that you could tell there was an editorial twist were Winona Terrace, the State Journal had its take, and the Cap Times had its take, and mayoral politics. But both newspapers supported civil rights. The State Journal was very strong for civil rights. Both newspapers supported urban renewal. The State Journal and the Capital Times both acknowledged mistakes, but said urban renewal is important. So when we get to the latter part of the decade, and the Cap Times is anti-war and the State Journal is anti-protester, we get more of a division. But the quality of journalism was really very high throughout the decade. Yeah?
You keep on repeating the mantra that the politicians weren't anti-Jewish or anti-Italian or anti-black when they destroyed the triangle. You pretend that the KKK did not march in the 1920s to the neighborhood and they want that neighborhood destroyed. What happens when you destroy a neighborhood that has synagogues, kosher butchers, kosher delis, and you destroy it, that makes it anti-Jewish. You don't have to read the city council writings to read anybody openly say, no, we're going to destroy the Jewish neighborhood. No, they don't openly say it, like the KKK does, but they do the same thing. So this repetition of this mantra, it's about time to end it.
Well, see, I think there's a difference between motive and result. And obviously some of the synagogues had closed and moved. I mean, the Beth Israel Center opened in 1950. Didn't Agudas Hakim close down before the triangle, before urban renewal? Obviously, there was Klan activity in the 1920s, and one of the things that strikes me is that there are police officers on the force in the 1960s who were working alongside police officers who had been on the force with Klansmen in the 1920s. But I think there is a difference between motive and result. The destruction of the neighborhood and the community was obvious and real. But based on the reports that I have read of the people who were in power in the 50s, I think they were oblivious to the neighborhood, not intending to break it up. Because, I mean, that's just my take. You can have a different take. Based on my reading of the correspondence and the reports and stuff that nobody ever thought was going to come to light, I don't see the malevolent intent. I see a bad result, but not a malevolent intent. Your mileage may vary. Anybody else? Yeah.
I've heard some mention recently about they want to start a museum for the city of Madison.
Mm-hmm.
We have the historical site on that, where they would actually have a building, the Madison City Museum,
Yes.
with all of the history and artifacts.
Yeah. Yes. It's in its earliest stages. Whether or not we'll be able to get the money to do it and a place to do it. But there are some municipalities around the country that have great local history museums, and it's in its early stages. We'll see if we can make it happen. Anybody else? Well, again, thank you all for coming. I believe they have books to sell. So I should go out and get ready to sign books in case anybody wants one.
My wife bought one, I should have brought.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe next time.
Next time.
Thank you, it was very interesting.
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming.
Did you enjoy yourself? Yes, we do too. We've known him for like 12 that, yes.
Oh, you do? Okay, I just wanted to say.
Dig it. You know what? I bet you stopped a lot of people. That's fine. We put them all together, so the idea will be at later.
Well, thank you so much. I hope this will be only copy. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. You like that? It's my homage to
Yeah, sure, it works.
I wasn't sure where to go for this. I always thought it was the history was the idea movie at the time. And then I said, no, he was the editor. I thought that was a good one.
It's so good.
Yeah, oh, we want you to I'm glad to see everybody in these books now.
Sure, we have a table with a blue tablecloth set up out there for you.
Yeah. Oh, the thing
I was a teacher, like, waiting after you, like, he said, I can't, I said, I don't want to, but, he said, I'm very upset. I'm going to talk to her. But, oh yeah,
He's not going anywhere. And I mean, it took, I did one of my jobs, and I did that.
I've never seen it anymore.
4 years now, but still, but I'm not, I'm old.
Oh, yeah, the girl that
Dave's younger.
yeah, I was listening to, she is. I'll go to her. Okay. I will go to her. And I'm telling you, yes, of course, I have been here for or stuff.
I hear come with you some, and this is very on my radar, but this came on my radar.
It's fixing to
And, you should have seen me trying to get here on that hard, because I don't do that.
And this might be some of them are, since this week, everything, but this is
Oh my God, well, I've seen, this is my favorite person in so now it is. She runs the East Side Youth Club. She's great. Anyway, she's great.
And has she come and spoken?
She has spoken at East Side.
So are you still living?
Still living, you too, right?
I charge
What?
You didn't know? Yeah.
But you know, it's so funny because did you?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then my process, you can, we didn't either. So, Johnson Street, Johnson War Street, we're closed right there.
Right, you were
So
landlocked.
East Wash, and I had lanes closed because of the water.
Right.
If you go down to Mifflin, there are black squares.
Right.
And then the Harvard River.
Right.
So my neighbors and I talked about,
I never have any.
so we don't necessarily worry about setting our senses like
Yeah, right. And we go to that.
Or get yourself out of the situation, which I realize.
we might not get the water.
Right.
I forgot because I was so upset.
Feeling so junky, and I had these opportunities to
It
go
just,
further.
it was very unpleasant. I don't want
Along
to be in
the
the class.
Lake Superior, Lake Huron, all those places. And
Well,
the
I would
people
love
that
to
visit,
see you
old
on
friends, they
Tuesday
go.
night, next Tuesday. It's a date.
And
You have saved my life.
it's jungle, yeah.
Don't worry about it. I'll be okay.
So nice to see you.
So good to see you.
Yeah,
So,
great.
you know, that's fine. How about, God, they should get names.
Sure.
Yeah,
I didn't know what to tell. It's on paper.
You know what's been fun is, every once in a while I still do it. I love going to the Jim Carell, Eric Benetton's
I haven't been to
thing.
any of those.
Well, Jim, they had a series of, they, you know, the micro cinema thing, and they have a lot of good fun things.
Oh, okay.
So, we just have to do that.
Yeah, I don't believe.
No, I tend to do that.
This is, you know, actually, I'm copying yours.
But yeah.
Yes, yeah. I know, you're like,
It's all good.
you did that, yeah.
You got your house,
There's a
you're,
lot of stuff
outside
that's
still
going on.
doing
I
things.
Yeah,
But it takes us for the most part.
almost a
This
second.
past year's been rough, just
Close to a second. To hear the word before you go on to the next one, but then it's already gone past. and we're
Sure.
like, whoa, you're not mad at me.
No, I know that I do that.
Beautiful.
I know that I do that. No, you're good.
You were adorable, so that's the
I
main
think
thing.
you.
Nobody gives a shit.
No, I appreciate that.
Thanks, Ellen.
Sure.
Foster sister, and it was just, you know, it was just.
Where was everybody?
Yeah, so I was just gonna copy over his,
Oh, no,
his stuff. So that was.
Yeah, that's no fun.
So I'm hoping I'm on a little even.
Yeah, you know,
that's-
after a while, you know, there won't be anybody left and then nobody will die.
Well, yeah, it's just.
Yeah, no,
You're such an
I'm dreading
optimist.
I'm dreading a sibling death. That's what I can't. I mean, it's, nobody's, you know, kicked yet, but
But, you know, yeah,
it's like,
yeah, it's,
and I have a friend that's going through dementia. And so that's a hard one.
yeah, that is, yeah, that is. Yeah, that's, yeah. You know, one friend is out east, so I can get to this, so we watch her every day, we talk on the phone and everything. And with her going through that process of the cancer.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And there was a friend here in Madison, and there was a group of us that ended up and we would go in and we'd sit with her, you know, when she was in kind of end-stage care, so that one of her best friends could have a break.
Right.
And that, you know, to watch somebody that you know is a really hard person, and really, you know,
Right,
just that process.
right. I just,